introduce you to the class. For those of you who don't know, Thad, he is a maverick historian and public intellectual renowned for his heterodox critiques of American history, emphasizing the influence of marginalized groups on societal progress. Thaddeus also runs a weekly Zoom show called Unreported and has a podcast, the Unregistered Podcast with Thaddeus Russell. He also is the author of this book, A Renegade History of the United States, and is currently...
Sorry, keep going.
And is currently working on his next book, his forthcoming book, on the history of World War II. He also has a Zoom after show for his patrons, and it's a lot of fun. I've joined on several occasions. But yes, tell me what I else missed in your introduction.
The Academy.
The Academy, the Menger Academy, of course, that he's a part of.
No!
Yes, yeah,
My Academy, the Unregistered Academy.
Unregistered Academy. Check it out, it's one of the premier academies online. He has courses all over the place with history, anarchy. You do have to sign up to join the course, if I'm correct.
That's deeply ironic, no?
But
or there's a very cheap monthly, very cheap.
Yes, and
subscription where you get access to everything just for a really low monthly fee. Either way.
And I won't be able to mention all the courses you offer, but it's definitely one of the best online courses, academies that you can find. Yes, so that is, thank you, welcome.
Tell them we put a link on our website.
And we'll put a link to your academy on our website.
We have a link already, I think. Do we?
Yes.
A link to his books.
Oh, we have a link to his books.
Oh, we'll add the Unregistered Academy link. Yep, you can do that?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, thank you, Todd.
All right. Well, I want to thank Darren, who, as I said, I've been hearing about for, it's more than a decade. No, now it's 15 years, isn't it? Yeah, I had students of mine come to me and say, you got to meet this guy. He's another adjunct that the school hates, just like you. And but he's just like you in so many ways, and he's got all these radical ideas that sound like yours. And somehow we never met until, well, Matthew here facilitated it. Matthew enrolled in Occidental, hoping that I would be there. And when he showed up on campus, I was gone because they had told me that there was no way they were going to hire for a tenure track position a white man. And I'm not making that up. This is in 2016. I don't know if Darren remembers when they did the hiring for the modern U.S. history position, but five people were brought to, there were 600 people who applied and 5 people were brought to campus as finalists, and all 5 of them were graduate students. And they were all African-American. But anyway, I digress. So I want to ask you guys, but yeah, thank you, Matthew and Darren. This is wonderful. I really appreciate it. This is a ton of fun. And this is a lecture I've never given. I have written about this, and this I will be basically presenting to you a lot of the content of Chapter 9 of A Renegade History of the United States. So if you want to investigate this more thoroughly and look at the list of sources, that's the place to go. Renegade History of the United States, Chapter 9. The title of that chapter is Shopping, the Real American Revolution. So I want to ask you guys, there it is, thank you. Because I don't know economics, being born and raised a socialist, we were assiduously kept away from economics books. They hid them from us. We weren't allowed into that section of the library. The only economist I've ever read, well, I had ever read until I was out of graduate school in my 30s. Okay, this is not a lie. This is not an exaggeration. People don't believe me when I say this. I have a Ph.D. from Columbia, okay, in history. I also taught philosophy at Columbia. So, fairly educated guy. I've been a political public intellectual for 3 decades now. The only economist I ever read was Karl Marx. Which means I don't really know much about economics. So I'm going to ask you guys a question that really gets to the heart of it, maybe. I mean, to me, it's the heart of the question in all of economics. I might be, speaking out of turn here, might be getting a little big for my britches, but I'll say this. It's the one question that I care about, which is this. So I want you guys to tell me what you guys have learned about this. What is the origin of a new product being brought to market? What's the very first thing that happens that leads to a new product being brought to market? What's the very first thing that must happen? Yes.
The idea must be born. In economics, this concept of like knowledge tends to be kind of like a proxy for like innovation, where the assumption is like as the knowledge of a country increases, so will the amount of ideas that come from it.
Yeah.
And so the origin of anything uh, is the idea.
I think you're very close, but not quite there. I think you're very close. Go ahead.
Oh,
Someone else?
I was gonna say maybe a disruption in the market presents an opportunity.
That's okay. But what causes the disruption? You're kind of begging the question.
Hmm.
Right. Right. So I heard an idea. Like I take it you mean like a new idea? Is there someone else? Or is that Matthew raising your hand? Matthew.
I have an idea.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the microphone.
How do you pronounce your name? Anirudh? How do you pronounce your name?
Oh, Anirudh.
Sorry.
How do you pronounce your name?
Anirudh, like like you're screaming.
Yeah, I got it.
Then me, well, I guess my knee doesn't show on camera. Then Ruth, like the
Ruth.
American name Ruth,
Gotcha.
but
Sri
with a
Lankan?
D, like no, Tamil, Indian Tamil, but I'm
Gotcha.
from America.
Gotcha.
So it's
I can
American
tell.
for Indian.
Okay, Anirudh, tell me what's the origin of the original origin of a new product being brought to market?
Desire.
Boom! We're done. Okay, I will take my check in the mail. Thank you, Matthew. Good night, everyone. Tamils are really smart, apparently. We should let more of them in. So an idea that's not stupid, because an idea, I would say, though, is the second human action. How about that, guys? Is an idea, have you heard of that? Have you heard of human action by any chance? An idea is a human action, is it not? I think Mises would agree with that. What does Mises say about that? He would say that's a human action, wouldn't he? An idea? The creation of a new idea?
All come from ideas, but thinking is a type of action, yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Human manifestation of ideas. So the origin is ideas.
There it is. There it is. It's the manifestation, or it's the ascription of language to a feeling, an emotion, a thought. An idea to me is language, right? An idea is language. Private property should belong to those who mix their labor with the soil. That's an idea that gave birth to classical liberalism and yada yada. It's desire, man. It's desire. And this is not, and I would say this about libertarian economists and philosophers. They don't miss this. They're not wrong about this. They're not like oblivious to it. And in fact, some of them have used a concept I'm going to introduce today, which you may have already known about and talked about, consumer sovereignty. So this is not a critique so much of libertarianism, except I would say that I would like to see more emphasis on this, because if we are right that the original origin of a new product being brought to market is desire, don't we want to study that a lot more? Don't we want to think that desire is a super important thing, kind of like fundamental, literally fundamental? That's what we now agree on, right? And understanding the relationship between desire and eventually bringing products to market and how it affects all things in capitalism and even in socialism. So you have to learn, if you want to understand, guys, the history of capitalism, don't you then have to understand first the history of desire? Weird concept. How the hell do you study that? Well, the good news is that I'm an American historian, and in this country, that story of desire changing over time and capitalism, modern industrial, and then what I would call consumer capitalism, the stuff that we know and love, responded and grew out of that changing desire or changing desires, right? So also the great thing about America is that we have been possibly, I don't know, but certainly one of the most conflicted, one might say schizophrenic cultures in world history around the question of desire, right? So think about this. Now, half of you guys are not from this country, but those of you who are, you'll feel this, I think, more closely. Like if you grew up here or spent a lot of time here, you'll feel what I'm talking about, right? So who American formal culture, meaning like the culture of the government, the culture of the public schools, the culture of all the major institutions, academia, who invented that? Who did that come from? The Pilgrims, right? The original Pilgrims, the white settlers. And what was their ideology? It was Calvinism, which we sort of have a generic name for. We call it Puritanism. And I think people are fairly well versed in what Puritanism means. But that's who, the founding fathers came out of. That they weren't exactly like the Calvinists, but that's who they were descended from culturally. And this idea of Puritanism or set of ideas of Puritanism, another level of abstraction up would be to call it asceticism. Asceticism. And asceticism is the doctrine of self-sacrifice for the greater good. And you can trace that all the way back to the Bible in particular the New Testament, in which in Romans, the Apostle Paul says to lay your body before God as a living sacrifice, to serve God by giving up all your desires and pleasures and self-interest. That's what Christianity has taught for more than 2,000 years. And that idea of asceticism, of sacrificing one's own desires, pleasures, and freedoms even, for some greater good, either for God or the greater community. Think about this, right? That concept, sacrifice what you want to do right now for the community. It could be God's community, or it could be the People's Republic of Pasadena. You know what I'm saying? That traces back to Plato in particular, Plato's Republic. You see it pretty clearly expressed in Plato's Republic. He doesn't talk about sacrificing one's interest for God, but he talks about sacrificing one's own interests and pleasures and desires for the Republic. The Republic, right? Which all of it stands to reason. We can't have a civilization unless people sacrifice their own interests at times, correct? I mean, that's just true, just logically true. Now, in America, though, that idea about self-sacrifice for a greater good took on, I would say, this is not the kind of language I usually use, but it's hard to avoid, and it's psychotic dimensions. So that in America, believe it or not, the dominant idea about work, which was derived from Calvinism and the Puritans directly, was, and you still see this today, but it certainly was the dominant idea about work all the way through the 19th century and into the 20th century, was that work should be done, get this, no matter what one gains from it, materially. So if one is a janitor making minimum wage, one should work with the same diligence one would work if they were an NBA star making $10 million a year. In fact, if you make $0 from work, you should do it anyway. Because that's what God commands according to the New Testament. I mean, so that was just the Puritan idea about work, which again, you still see strains of this today, don't you? Don't you? In Americans, especially upper class sort of formal thinking, we are trained as Americans, and this is unusual, we're not like Europeans, right? Europeans don't have this in their culture. This is why they work hundreds of hours fewer per year than Americans do. Look up the statistics. Hundreds of hours on average, each person in Europe, hundreds of hours less per year. And I've argued long that it's because of the culture, that they simply did not internalize this Puritan idea about work the way that we in America have. On material comforts, like clothing was a big thing for the Puritans. Clothing was a big thing for the early Americans. And again, when I talk about these people, I'm talking about the elites, the ones who set the formal culture, right? The idea that was promulgated by Benjamin Franklin in particular, but across the American elites leading up to the American Revolution, all the way through the 19th century, is that men should wear what? A single business suit, the color of which is either black or navy blue. And most importantly, it must look like every other business suit on the market. My good friend Michael Zakim wrote the history of this, the history of the business suit in America, and that's what he found. It was an attempt to sheathe the body in a formless, now it became sort of a sex object later unintentionally, but it was intended, the business suit, the men's business suit was intended to be asexual, to counter pleasure, to counter desire, to hide men's bodies and make them all look uniform and the same, to contribute to this idea of self-sacrifice for a greater good. One must work and be focused entirely on the work, the business, instead of what one might want to do in any one instance. So it's a uniformity imposed on people to get them to be more disciplined. The idea of wearing something that is fashionable, satanic. The idea of wearing something that would simply make you look good, satanic. And I'm not exaggerating. If you look at the children's textbooks in early America, if you look at American novels, literature, poetry, if you look at the speeches of clergy and politicians and major orators, they all say this all the way through the 19th century and even into the 20th century. This was a comically puritanical country. Europeans would come here, and there's lots and lots of evidence of this. Europeans would come and write their diaries about traveling in America, and all the time they would comment about how ridiculously uptight and repressed Americans were. So this culture, this Puritan culture, was the dominant culture in American life all the way into the 20th century. Really funny stuff, if it weren't so tragic, because what it meant was people lived basically subsistence lives. They lived in, I would say, self-imposed subsistence economies because of this Puritanism. So let me tell you this. Imagine this, guys. In the early 19th century, okay, kind of the height of the puritanical era in America, the early 19th century, America's brand new. It's been around for a few decades, right? So let's say between 1800 and the Civil War, 1861, right in there, okay? The typical average American, and this means more than 90%, this means more than 90% of Americans, they grew their own food. Or maybe bartered it with a nearby farmer. 90% of Americans in that period lived where? On farms in rural areas. They grew their own food. They made their own clothing. Not because it was fun, but because they had to. Get this. 90% of Americans during that period, this is most of the 19th century, like the first 100 years of American history. 90% of Americans never moved far, or never traveled farther than 50 miles from the place of their birth. Fuck that shit. Which is something I want that inserted into the economic literature. Like, we need to be really clear if we are interested in human action and human flourishing and human abundance. Fuck that shit. There is nothing good about Puritanism from our point of view. Now, if you want to choose to be a Puritan and an ascetic, God bless you. And in fact, that's what you should do, is be blessing God and acting according to God and live in a monastery and all. That's great. But thank God, or whoever is responsible for this, the vast majority of people, not just in America, but around the world, have said, fuck that shit. And they've said it in all sorts of ways that weren't verbal. They did it through action. So one of the reasons I dumped the idea that ideas are the origin of new products being brought to market is that in this chapter in my study of the industrial consumer revolution in America, which is in the late 19th century, I can't even think of a single tech quote from anybody, any of the consumers that I'm writing about or talking about. I have no idea what they thought. I'm talking about ordinary Americans who began the consumer revolution, right? They didn't write diaries. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't make movies. They didn't write novels. They didn't give speeches. They didn't march in protests demanding fur coats and nice shoes, etc. So I have no idea. But what I do goddamn well know is they did a whole lot of human action. Like a whole lot of human action that I believe is the greatest revolution in human history. As you guys, I'm sure, know, the vast majority of revolutions have really sucked and resulted in usually more violence, more repression, dictatorships arising out of them. That's usually what happens. This revolution that I'm talking to you about today, that I've written about, is entirely grassroots, bottom up, from the poorest people that changed the way we all live for the better. And I mean immensely better. And it was done not by elites. It wasn't done by the middle class. It wasn't even done by capitalists. Capitalists facilitated it, for sure, but they're not the origin of it, as we just decided. The origin of the revolution that we are all benefiting from right now, those computers in front of you, are because of these people I'm talking about today. So as I said, early in the 19th century, the first 100 years of America, 90+% of Americans lived on a farm. They grew their own damn food. They made their own damn clothing. They never left their hometown. Just abysmal. Just abysmal. By the late 19th century, say by 1880, 1890, most Americans, this is how fast this revolution was, most Americans purchased their food. Most Americans by 1880, 1890 purchased their clothing from these things called department stores, which were brand new at that time. Most Americans, and this is what freaked out the Puritans more than anything, most Americans spent money on clothes that simply made them look good. Weren't functional at all. Purely about fashion and style and self-aggrandizement. Exactly what you're not supposed to do, according to Puritans. You were supposed to be modest and humble and wear that black suit. If you're a woman, what did Puritans and Victorians think that women should wear? They should be clothed from literally the top of their neck to their toes. Sort of famously. And then their hair was piled up on top of their head. This was the Victorian and Puritan model. Piled up high on their head to what represent the weight of motherhood. But by the end of the 19th century, women were leading the consumer revolution that liberated all of us. The railroad, of course, was invented during this time. And within a few years, by the 1910s, of course, the automobile as well, which really was the next wave of the revolution. But even before then, you have that. You have the advent of refrigeration. So all of a sudden, imagine you live on a farm and the only thing you can eat is what you grow or get from the nearby farmer. That means no cold anything, right? That means no ice cream. That means no cold beer. That means nothing. Things go bad very quickly. By the end of the 19th century, refrigeration had been invented and deployed widely within the economy. And then with the advent of the railroad, you had refrigerated cars on railroads, so you could get frickin' ice cream delivered to you from New York City if you lived on a farm in Pennsylvania. Women and some men, by the turn of the 20th century, were ordering clothes from catalogs in Paris. Even working class people who were not wealthy were doing that. Even ex-slaves were doing that. Because it became possible. This is a revolution that I think that libertarians, they're not wrong, but I just think they need more attention paid to this. And the other good thing is when libertarians pay attention to this issue, as I'm going to try to demonstrate to you right now, one of the nice things about it is you will find that the heroes of this story, which I believe is the greatest story in human history, the greatest story of liberation in human history, the heroes of it, the primary heroes of it, the drivers of the consumer revolution were black people, in particular slaves and ex-slaves, women, and gays.
That's a bar.
You could throw in Jews as well if you want to be like perfectly politically something. But yeah, I mean those four groups, honestly, you will find them and immigrants generally. Immigrants generally, especially Italian and Jewish immigrants. So guess which group in American history was the first to not reject the Puritanism, but to ignore it and build their own culture that was nothing like Puritanism? African Americans, slaves on plantations, because they weren't allowed to integrate into that ridiculous repressive culture. They developed their own culture, which we call black culture, African American culture, whatever you want, slave culture, which is very open to dancing and sexuality and self-aggrandizement and dressing in fashionable ways and being stylistic and wearing bright colors. If you know anything about the history of black culture, you will know what I'm talking about. And that began among slaves who would either steal their master's clothing or borrow it. Masters often gave away their clothing. And what slaves preferred was the clothing of aristocrats. They wanted to look as good as you possibly could. And this was called by the puritanical moral guardians living above one's station. That's what was said. Living above one's station. The most totalitarian, repressive concept in human history, one that I hate more than anything. If you're born into a particular class, you should never pretend to be anything better than that. You should live your life wearing black and navy blue work clothes. But no, the slaves developed an entire culture that to this very day is the most popular culture in human history. So during the 19th century, when slaves are developing new art forms, music forms, blues, and then jazz comes out of that, which then gives rise to rock and roll and R&B and hip hop and like most pop culture now, that the origins of that are on the plantations. And what happened? Whites from the North found out about it. And they started traveling down to southern plantations to check out what the Negroes were doing on the plantations. And they got so turned on by it, they invented this whole entertainment industry called minstrelsy. Minstrel shows, which are now derided as just being simply racist. In the early years, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when all of white America was obsessed with this puritanical craziness of repressing everything that's fun, blacks on the plantations were having a whole lot of fun and were becoming famous for it. And these white guys would go down there and check it out and stay with them and study them. And then they would go imitate them. They would take them back to New York City or Philadelphia or Chicago, and they would put on performances pretending to be black slaves and dancing and telling jokes and singing and having a great time. And it became the most popular form of entertainment in America. Blackface minstrelsy was the most popular form of entertainment in America for 100 years, through this very period, to this time when I'm talking about the transition from Puritanism to the consumer revolution and all the liberation it gave us. That time, the 19th century, blackface minstrelsy, which was white men imitating blacks who they believed were simply having more fun, which they were, even though they were slaves. Incredible stories, incredible evidence of white people imitating slaves all through the 19th century, sometimes making fun of them, sometimes putting them down, but overwhelmingly, and this is in my book, this is in chapter 2 of my book, overwhelmingly, and they talked about this, they wrote songs, celebrating, emulating, loving black culture because it offered freedom of the body that they couldn't have in a puritanical, repressive culture. So there's them. So I give the first credit to the slaves, the very, very origins of the consumer revolution, the first expressions of any kind of desire for things that Puritans wouldn't allow is on the plantations. It's on the plantations. The next thing that happens, right? So slavery is abolished in 1865. And by then you had some immigrants, you had large numbers of Germans, and you had significant numbers of Irish immigrate. And the Irish were very renegade and they weren't puritanical at all. They were known for their drinking and dancing, as a matter of fact. So the Irish immigrants who came in the 1830s and 1840s in large numbers, they get the second credit. I don't know if you know this, but Irish immigrants co-invented the tap dance with blacks who lived in New York City at the time in the 1840s, and the tap dance is huge in the history of American culture because that gave rise to sort of everything that we all enjoy on Spotify and in YouTube and all the much of popular entertainment. Beyonce is like directly traced right back to tap dance. The Irish immigrants who came beginning in the 1830s, they get the second credit. But then after the Civil War, 1860s, 70s, 80s, then things really start to change because industrial capitalism had begun. And industrial capitalism depends on how you define it, but most historians say that it begins with the first factories in England in the 1780s, 1790s. The first factory in the United States America was 1793, I think it was, but it didn't really take off until the 1830s. The 30s is when you see like factory systems across the Northeast in particular. And you see the first railroads too at that time. But steel production, oil production has barely started at this point, right? So industrial capitalism is pretty primitive. But what you don't see, so capitalism is, it has started in earnest, even though most Americans are living on farms nowhere near anything that's capitalist. But there were cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, were, cities with maybe 100,000 people-ish in them. And the thing was, capitalism through that period, think about I just described the general culture, the norms of the time among Americans, right? Until the Civil War, I just described to you what most Americans thought. So tell me what you think capitalism was producing until 1865 in this country. Steel girders, maybe. Utilitarian shoes and work pants and work shirts. The business suit was just beginning, but yeah, the business suit, all of which looked the same, uniform. There was very little attention paid to consumer pleasures because it was a overwhelmingly puritanical economy, puritanical political economy and culture. So there wasn't, even if there was desire for nice clothes and nice food from other places, it was difficult to express it without being punished. And any capitalist enterprise that would have come along and produced anything other than whiskey was the one thing that was allowed, that was hedonistic. But hedonism of any kind, even mild hedonism, was not, I'm not kidding, was not frowned upon. It was considered to be Satan's tool. Satan's tool to lead you into sin and degradation and hell. So it was an industrial capitalist economy, overwhelmingly. You couldn't find a nice pair of shoes that looked good to save your life if you were anything other than an aristocrat. There were no movies. There was no ice cream. There was no cold beer. There was no train taking you to another city. There were no novels. Novels. You know what novels are? Books of fiction, like long plots. Like Harry Potter was originally a novel. There was no novel in the early 19th century in America. The only books that were widely available to working class people were biblical books, either the Bible itself or they were religious tomes, moral studies, nothing fun whatsoever. So there was nothing to go by. There were no department stores because of the culture, right? So one could say that the original origin of new products being brought to market is the culture, whatever's in the culture. And if desire is in the culture, then you're going to get new products. If the desire is not in the culture, you're going to be living on your farm, eating the same carrots you've been eating for 25 years. So that changed, as I said, with first the slaves, who gave whites in the North this whole new model of living, this whole new example for how to live. You can live and enjoy your body. You can live and enjoy the clothes you wear. You can live above your station, right? You can get things and products and goods and services from elsewhere. That's not a bad thing, etc. And then the first immigrants, the Irish, as I said, who began coming in and drinking hard and partying hard and dancing and doing a lot of stuff that looks sort of like the consumer culture now, right? Just with many fewer resources, but they did it. Heroes, heroes, heroes. But then, as I said, after the Civil War, 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, what happens then in American history, which now we are all debating constantly? The first great wave, it's often called the Great Wave or the Great Migrant Wave. The Great Wave of immigration begins in earnest, and it was crazy. Trump, et cetera, they talk about the percentages of illegal immigrants, and it's 20 million, they say, maybe it is, out of there's 350 million Americans. Back then, between 1880 and 1920, by 1920, 1/3 of Americans were immigrants. 1/3. I mean, this was a complete transformation. Not a complete, it was a massive, massive transformation of American society, culture, politics, everything. But in particular, I'm here to argue that the effect it had on the American economy was profound. And again, these are the second wave of heroes, because Jews from Russia or Ukraine, where some of my family came from, or Italians from Sicily, Sicilians, there was a lot of Sicilians who came during that time. A lot of Slavs came in, Greeks came in. They didn't know who John Calvin was. They didn't know who the Puritans were. They didn't know about John Locke and classical liberalism and the idea of self-discipline to make money and all that. They didn't know about the Protestant American strictures against drinking, the temperance movement, the original prohibition movement that began in the 1830s. Notice when the Irish came in and industrial capitalism started producing whiskey in mass quantities. Mass production of whiskey was a big part of that. The rise of the saloon, consumer culture, was met by the Puritans with the temperance movement, which in 80 years was successful. And alcohol was banned by 1920. But my gosh, the Sicilians, when they came in, how do you think they felt about wine? And there's just so many stories of Sicilians who first came to Louisiana, New Orleans, and then Chicago, then New York, of drinking wine, getting busted by the Prohibition cops. And then, of course, eventually, by the 1920s, when the Protestant American Puritans ban alcohol, what do the Sicilians do very famously in regard to alcohol? They form a mafia and begin distributing it illegally all across the country and becoming very, very famous and wealthy for it. Now, some of the mafia who did that killed people. Some of them were also murderers because they were entering what? A black market. And who enters a black market? Bad people. True. But that's not all the mafia did. Mostly what they did was simply import an illicit product. And do you know how popular alcohol was in the 1920s in America? Like, you can read my book for story after story of people loving the gangsters, loving the Sicilians because they were providing the wine and the booze and the gin and the whiskey. So that's the second group of heroes. Gangsters. It was also Jewish gangsters, by the way. Jewish gangsters and Sicilian gangsters in the 1920s led the gangs that subverted prohibition, subverted it by distributing the alcohol illegally, right? Which made it impossible to enforce, which ultimately led to repealing prohibition in 1932. Jewish and Italian gangsters are heroes. They are the ones who subverted the stupidest, worst, most repressive law in human history, or American history. And I think almost everyone agrees with that. Who gets credit for that? Gangsters, of course. Immigrants generally, though, would be the third group of heroes. Immigrants, because they didn't, just like the slaves, They never had this Puritan culture, right? They were never a part of that. They didn't grow up in it. They come from another culture that has totally different ideas about drinking, leisure, the Puritan work ethic that one must work no matter what one gains from it, the craziest thing to everyone else in the world but Americans. The Sicilians and the Jews and all the new immigrants of this time who came in, the Slavs, the Russians, thought that was insane. And so they would take breaks at work and they would drink at work and they would not think about working overtime for free and all that stuff. So, and then the fourth group was gays. Gays in this country become an identifiable social group in the late 19th century. This is the first time that the concept of homosexuality is invented, the idea of gays is invented. And once that's done in the late 19th century, and this goes to Foucault if you want to get at the origins of this, once the concept of homosexuality and then especially the concept of a gay man were invented, right? And then like that was filled in with all these characteristics. Oh, gay men are really into aesthetics and gay men are really into fashion and gay men are really into living in the cities. And so, what happens? All these men suddenly identify as, oh, you're like, oh, that's me. I'm gay. And then you see like reports by 1900, 1910 around there of groups of gay men congregating in all the cities and doing all these things like dancing and drinking and fornicating and all this stuff. And gays in America disproportionately, although they never constituted more than 1 or 2% at most of the population, vastly disproportionately populated the new emerging consumer economy. So songwriters, filmmakers, novelists, fashion designers, lots and lots of gays, lots and lots of Jews, lots of Italians. And who are they selling to? Overwhelmingly women. Women. So imagine this. You're a woman in America in 1850, 1840, 1820. You're living on a farm, most likely, right? You're not the farmer. Either your husband or your father is the farmer, so you don't own the farm. Oh, also, by the way, there were called coverture laws, which made it impossible for women to own the property in a marriage. So even if you were married to the farmer, you didn't own the farm. Usually it was your father, though, right? Most women in America who lived on farms were young women living on their dad's farm. So they had zero property, zero power. They lived nowhere near a city. There were no trains. There were no cars. They couldn't get anywhere. Man, what happens with the advent of the big cities after the Civil War, right? Because you see what happens with capitalism. You also see urbanization. In every country on earth where there is capitalism, there is rapid urbanization, a concentration of populations in cities. And man, when that happened, as I said, in the early 19th century, the big cities were like 100,000, 200,000, pretty small. But by the end of the 19th century, New York City was a true megalopolis. It was getting there. And many hundreds of thousands of people lived there in all the cities, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago. By 1900, these were very large cities with massive concentrations of people, almost all of whom came from where? Outside of cities. And in particular, women. I mean, people have actually told me they've gotten moved from my chapter on this because of it really is a story of immense, widespread human liberation for the lowest orders of society, right? So women in particular, just imagine you're a woman living on some goddamn farm in like Western Massachusetts owned by your father. And then you find out that there's a textile mill that's just been opened up in Lowell, Massachusetts. This was the first textile mill in the 1830s. And that they're only employing women because they felt that women were more compliant and more easily like molded to industrial work for whatever weird reason. And they're paying wages. They're paying cash money for you to work. Oh, and also Lowell is 50 miles away, 100 miles away, 200 miles away. Means you got to go live there in Lowell, which became one of America's first big cities. They were called the Lowell Mill Girls. And then there were textile mills all over New England that developed during this time, the 1830s, 1840s, 50s, 60s, right? And then you had full-on proper textile factories making garments in New York City in particular. And so women now are moving to New York City. Immigrant women were moving to New York City from peasant life in Europe, but also from farm life in America. So in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, by 1900, 1910, you have hundreds of thousands of young women, and 60% of them at that time were employed in industrial occupations, making their own wages, their own money. And you know what they did with that money? They partied. This is not an exaggeration. It's kind of an amazing, read my chapter, but there's so many descriptions of what these young, they were called working girls. There was even a name for them, this whole generation of young American women. Most were immigrants, but many were not. But young women working in industrial jobs. They were brand new, right? There was no such thing for women just 20, 30 years before that. And because of that, you had young women making their own money, living outside their home, living out from under the thumb of their father or their husband. Let me say this again, with their own money. For the first time in human history, women had their own money. As a group, as a class, working class women, poor women, immigrant women, farm women, for the first time in human history, women had their own money. And what did they do? They went to Coney goddamn Island. They went to amusement parks that were built, developed, created by capitalists in that time to cater to this brand new giant market of young women with money who wanted to party. And Coney Island became the biggest destination of amusement in the world by 1900, 1910. It's world famous even to this day for that reason, because almost every young working class person in New York City, and even from farther away, went to Coney Island on a regular basis. The motion picture industry, cinema, invented by Thomas Edison in the 1870s and 80s, takes off in the 1880s, 1890s, 90s, takes off huge. You may have heard of Nickelodeons, not the Nickelodeon channel, what it's named after. Nickelodeons were giant sort of movie palaces, and you could go and put a nickel into a viewer, and you look into the viewfinder, and you could see a movie play. Revolutionary. There were no motion pictures before. There were barely pictures before, barely photos before. That became an enormous, that sort of replaced minstrel shows as the most popular form of entertainment in the late 19th century. And mostly women went to movies. We have surveys of this. Mostly women were doing this. They just found this new liberation. And what they did with their freedom was go have fun. Go have fun. Fashion, as I said, department stores developed during this time. Macy's, let me read the list. Huge number of, I don't have the list somewhere, but there were just 10 or 12 department store chains nationally were invented right then at this time. And overwhelmingly, the customers there were women, young women, buying fashions that simply made them look good from other places, from Europe, all over the world. The Puritans still were around, and they hated this. They hated this. The elites, the cultural elites, the people who ran the newspapers, the political elites, government officials, even a lot of big business leaders, and even labor union leaders hated this. Hated this. And railed against what working class people were doing with their money during this time. And what they found was that shopping, dime novels, dancing, dance halls, jazz music, fashion, I said fashion, amusement parks were even more popular than they had feared. Multiple studies were done during this period. In 1924, in New York City alone, 6 million men and women attended dance halls. Over 10% of the women and men between the ages of 17 and 40 in New York went dancing at least once a week. And because of this, the Puritans fought back. There were, during this period, again, we're talking about between 1880 and 1920s, right? During that period, more than 60 city governments around the country attempted to regulate the styles of dancing in dance halls, and many of them closed down the dance halls altogether. So let me tell you about the opposition to this incredible revolution of human liberation. The opposition, as I said, began with the original Puritans, of course, who, as I said, were mostly in the clergy, political leadership. The first abolitionists were hugely puritanical and hated the culture of the slaves, and they hated the culture of the women. Feminists, the first suffragists, the women who led the movement that resulted in women getting the vote in 1920, they spent most of their time railing against the desires, the expressed desires of women at this time. They wrote books about it. They launched reform movements. They launched the social purity movement in the 1880s and 1900s, which tried to abolish prostitution, but also tried to instruct women as to how to use their money in proper, respectable ways, which was to dress like a matron and never go to Coney Island and never read those dirty dime novels. So feminists, the early puritanical clergy and political leaders, and then progressives. So you may know that the period we're talking about, again, roughly 1880s to the 1920s, that period is known as what also? Is known as the progressive era, right? If you've ever studied American history at all, you've heard that term. That's known as the progressive era. That's the rise of the progressive movement. That is the origin of the modern day Democratic Party. That is the origin of modern day American liberalism, even though it's been morphed and changed in various ways. The lineage, the ancestral lineage of modern liberalism, what we now call liberalism, goes right back to the progressive era. And those people, the progressives, and these were mostly public intellectuals, some clergy, activists, political activists, some government leaders, a lot of intellectuals, though. They were particularly concerned about this because they were worried about the decline in order in the cities. They were kind of pre-MAGA in that way. Honestly, they were sort of proto-MAGA because with all the immigrants, yeah, there was a lot of craziness in the streets in New York City. It wasn't like they were all doing, angelic things all the time. Most of them were doing wonderful things that we all love to this day. I had a bagel for breakfast today. Thank God for the Jewish immigrants. I mean it. Like, that was just the beginning of that. Have you had a burrito lately? But yeah, of course, there were also gangsters. There were also criminals. A lot of illiterate people, a lot of uneducated people, a lot of poor people living in crowded slums in the Lower East Side, etc. And yeah, and they were speaking different languages, right? Yiddish or Italian or whatever, right? And the progressives sort of emerged largely, and everyone agrees on this, by the way, largely emerged as a movement, get this, against immigration, as a sort of a reaction to this perceived disorder. The old Protestant WASP elites had controlled America until then, and now they saw it's just like Trump now, just like MAGA now. Very, very similar rhetoric. In fact, I should write about this, but it's called nativism, and progressives kind of led that movement. Get out the foreigners. They speak different languages. They have different customs, different values, different cultures. They bring in extended families. We're a country of the nuclear family. These damn Jews and Sicilians bring in mom and dad and grandpa and grandma and uncles and aunts and cousins, and they all live in this little tenement together. Just like what's being said about Mexicans now, right? Same stuff. So progressives then, one of their missions, one was prohibition. They wanted to stop people from drinking, so they were leaders of the prohibition movement. But during this time, they saw the consumer revolution happening, and they hated it because they saw people not sacrificing themselves for the greater good, for the nation, which is what progressives were all about. Progressives were always all about social engineering, order, and efficiency. Social efficiency. They actually had a movement called the social efficiency movement. And so I said these are a lot of academics. Progressives were a lot of academics, a lot of public intellectuals. They sponsored these studies of working class spending habits at this time and found that, guess what? Working class people and immigrants living in the big cities, which by that point was a majority of the people in the cities, were spending lots of money on beer and wine and whiskey. They were spending money on ice cream and candy. They were spending money on going to the movies. They were spending money on going to Coney Island. The women were spending money on dime novels. Dime novels were the first cheap form of entertainment. Mostly women read them, like adventure, romance kind of things, right? But they were hugely popular, completely anti-puritanical, totally hedonistic. All this stuff is truly hedonistic, and God bless all of it for that very reason, right? So the progressives did all these studies, especially during World War I, for obvious reasons. They wanted a really disciplined nation during World War I. So they wanted to correct the spending habits of working class Americans. And they issued these budgets through the government. The federal government commissioned all these public intellectual progressives to issue these suggested or proposed budgets, household budgets for all working class people, which of course had no beer, no wine, no candy, no ice cream, no dancing, no amusement parks, no dime novels. Now, the good news is, thank God, we won. We won. Unless there's someone here who is unhappy about that revolution happening, right? And I don't think you'd find too many Americans who would think that was a bad thing in general. We won. So as I said, the immigrants, the Jews and the Italians and the Sicilians, they subverted prohibition, which was the apotheosis of Puritanism in this country, right? They demolished it. It was banned. It was repealed in 1932. And we know what happened with Hollywood. By the 1920s, it was becoming dominant and remained so for decades. Dance halls, the jazz age. You may have heard of the 1920s. What is it known as? Also, it's known as the jazz age. Yes, it wasn't just jazz music. It was dancing, was huge. Social dancing, because as I said earlier, what was it? 10% of New Yorkers danced more than once, went dancing more than once a week. That became dominant all through World War II. The swing craze, all that stuff. The amusement parks, Coney Island, there were then like amusement parks in every city, imitating Coney Island. The dime novels became even more popular. Yeah, and then the car, the automobile. My God, once Henry Ford got going in the 1920s, mass production of automobiles, making it possible again, finally by the 30s, for working class, middle class people to afford and own a car. Think of what that did to the culture, to a culture of conservatism, repression, puritanism, anti-sexuality, anti-leisure, work ethic culture. Imagine what that did. You're in a family, you have girls in your family, and there's a car now. Or you have kids, children, right? And so there's report after report after report of young women stealing their mom's car, their dad's car, and driving to a dance hall and dancing with black men and having sex with Jewish men and whatever, right? So the other major opposition to the consumer revolution, and no one ever talks about this. So I said it was the early Puritans, sort of the Puritan culture, right? Feminists always were opposed to it, still are. Deep asceticism in feminist culture. The progressives, the most sort of powerful and influential left-wing movement in history. And then what took off in the 1920s, and there were 6 million members of this organization, and their primary motivation was to shut down the dance halls and to keep immigrant men from predating, they thought, on white women, was the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, this is the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. The first iteration was after the Civil War. That's the one that's most famous. That's a different story for a different time. The second Ku Klux Klan emerged in the 1920s. It was much larger, as I said, 6 million members. 1 out of 13 white Protestant Americans were members of the Ku Klux Klan. 1 out of 13. People who were eligible for membership were members in the 1920s. And as I said, by then, they were no longer really concerned with blacks anymore. They were mostly concerned with the immigrants and especially the consumer revolution. They didn't call it that, but the dance halls, the saloons, the drinking, which took off during Prohibition because of Prohibition. Women were allowed into the speakeasies, places they were never allowed in before, because they were run by gangsters, and gangsters didn't give a shit. They just wanted the customers. So there's this breakdown of all these gender norms and all these puritanical norms. And the Ku Klux Klan stepped in to save America, and that's how they talked. And you know what mostly the Ku Klux Klan did? They didn't lynch black people during that time, hardly any. They didn't set up crosses on fire on black people's porches. I mean, there were a few instances like that during this time, but overwhelmingly, you know what they did? They ran patrols, either in cars or on horseback, on the back roads around every town and city, looking for women making out in cars or having sex in cars with immigrant men. And then when they found them, they would haul the girl to her parents, publicly shame her, and beat the shit out of the immigrant guy and threaten to deport him. They set fire to dance halls and saloons and movie palaces. Cinemas were set afire by the Ku Klux Klan during this time. They wanted to return to the old, pure, pre-immigrant, pre-women's liberation, true women's liberation, the one that I've been talking about. They wanted to go back to the pre-era when America, at least in their minds, was the puritanical city on a hill where none of this satanic stuff was going on. But what happened to the Klan? For various reasons, they dissolved in the 1930s. They were repressed, but they also sort of fell apart. People left the Klan. There was sort of corruption scandals in the Klan, and it ceased to exist as an organization by 1930. But I argue that they had zero chance of succeeding because overwhelmingly Americans were demonstrating with their feet and most importantly with their wallets, with their own money, especially these young women, that they wanted to have fun. They liked things. They liked pleasure. They liked clothes. They liked food. They liked dancing. They liked drinking. They liked jazz. They liked amusement parks. They liked novels. They liked movies. They liked leisure. They liked time off. And they won to this day. Although the Puritans still remain as an impulse in our culture. I think you all know this. And what I was going to say about an hour ago to you was, to this day, you see this schizophrenic, split personality, conflicted idea in the American minds. So walk down the street, walk down Colorado Boulevard Avenue, Colorado Avenue, and look at the billboards. Look at the billboards. You'll probably see a woman in a bikini. You'll probably see an ad for whiskey or beer, wine, or something like that. You'll probably see an ad for like a travel spot or someplace to go have fun, a beach vacation, something also hedonistic. Or like some dumb new movie or TV show, like advertised on the side of the bus, right? Hedonism. We see this. We see this all the time in American culture, right? There's no shortage of hedonism, am I right? In American popular culture. But at the same time, we still haven't given up on the Puritanism. This is never, I'm almost done. There's no difference, really, in the way that American teachers, politicians, clergy talk about leisure, work, the work ethic. It's all seen as sort of like, the consumer culture is all seen as skeptically, if not outright negatively. And then, of course, the left in this country, descendants of the progressives, hate it. Hate it. And what is the argument by the left about consumer culture? I will tell you, it's in 3 words in the title of the very first academic history written of the consumer revolution. It's called Captains of Consciousness. Captains of Consciousness. All left-wing historiography on this question have said that, the reason we have consumer revolution is because the poor working class people, especially those women, were tricked by advertisers to want things that they didn't actually need or want. False consciousness is what they had. The reason we have nice things is because all those people had false consciousness. They didn't really want to go to Coney Island and watch movies, but they were told to by the advertisers. So this, of course, to me is a profoundly elitist, condescending position that has been taken by the left against the working class for more than 100 years now. So I guess I'll leave it there. But let me just say, I'll read the last paragraph of my chapter. The generation of working class women, but I could add immigrants and gays to it as well, and the ex-slaves, who drove the generation of women who drove the American Revolution of leisure and pleasure, overcame the opposition of protective parents who didn't want them to work outside the home or have their own money. They broke through the common belief that women seeking pleasure in public spaces was immoral and degenerate. And they simply ignored the Puritan and Victorian proscriptions against indolence, extravagance, and dissipating luxury. They created the weekend, and for this alone, they should be considered national heroes. But they accomplished something even more phenomenal. Against all odds, they created American fun. So I will leave it at that. The whole history, the whole story of the creation of the American weekend, I haven't even gotten to. We can get into that in the questions if you would like. But it's the same set of heroes and the same set of villains is in the story of why we have the weekend. So with that, I went over time a little bit, but I'd love to hear anything y'all have to say.
Yeah.
I can't hear your applause. You have to be louder, much louder. I can't. You have to stand up. I can't. Y'all have to stand up and cheer. Then I'll hear it.
You got a mic? You have the mic over there?
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much for the lecture. I have a question. You started off asking us what drives innovation, and the answer to that was desire. But maybe I missed it, but I didn't necessarily catch desire for what. And could this desire? I just heard Professor Jordan jokingly say that it's sex, but I actually like pretty seriously think that like a lot of what you were saying is kind of driven by the human desire to reproduce. And I was wondering what you think about that.
So this is where I think we need to just give up our attempts at analysis. I mean this, where it becomes inexplicable, maybe ineffable, maybe mystical. I don't know, but like I can't explain, nor will I ever be able to explain, and therefore I don't want to try to explain why people want particular things at particular times. I just don't think you can find it. Like, because you can show someone a cheeseburger right now, like an ad for a cheeseburger, and a lot of people will want it, and some people won't want it. Why, why was the McGriddle sandwich popular when it was, right? I mean, why did the Model T car take off in the 1920s? It's why was this crazy invention, the iPhone, like how did Steve Jobs come up with that and why? And he sensed that were a lot of people in the world. And I remember saying right before, like a year before he invented this, I remember saying, you know what? I kind of feel this is like in whenever this was, the early 2000s. I remember saying, you know what? I think one day there's going to be like some device that'll fit in my back pocket that'll have the access to all information on the earth. And there he was. And they invented it. He sensed that there were people who wanted that. Why did I want that? I don't know. Did everybody want that? No. And they wanted it for different reasons too. I wanted to have access to all the information on earth in my pocket. Other people want to have access to porn in their pocket. All good, but like they're different reasons, and I can't explain why. So I don't know if we're ever gonna. You don't need to answer that question, but I think you just need to answer. And in fact, don't Rothbard and Mises kind of deal with this? Like don't they treat like personal expressions of desire, valuation, right, as being sort of autonomous and like sort of yeah.
Yeah, subjective valuation.
Yeah.
I don't, just to me, like the kind of notion of American fun and like all the facets through which it like showed itself throughout history, it seems to me for some reason that like they were all aiding masturbative reproduction for humanity. But maybe that's just like a silly correlation, or maybe they I don't know. Yeah.
Some people have had a definite desire to reproduce. I've known a lot of them. And I've known a lot of people who have had no desire to reproduce. And so I don't think either one is natural or human nature. I think the concept of human nature is a really bad one. I just think it's stupid and unsupportable. I just don't think there is such a thing. You just can't prove it because there's always so many exceptions to everyone's claim of what human nature is. Again, I really like the way Mises and Rothbard deal with this question, which is like, let people want what they want and don't try to explain it or, just, okay, now we know, but there is the data. The data point is a desire, right? And we take that seriously and we look at what happens from that desire. And what I'm saying is the advent of the consumer revolution and the liberation of all people to have nice things is what came from that. But like why they want particular things at particular times, like, I don't know. Like it's inexplicable. But I do know the other thing is I've said this in the lecture, for whatever good reason, whatever, thank God. And again, I don't want to like try to explain why this is, but it's simply a fact, right? That since the consumer revolution of the 1880s began in earnest, the last 150 years, the vast, vast majority of people on planet Earth have loved it, have wanted it. In particular, people outside of America, for God's sake. I mean, how many immigrants have come here simply because of that? Because you could get good stuff here, right? And have a nicer material life. The only thing they get disappointed in is that we work so much here. So that is the, you guys should look up the statistics. I have it somewhere. I have a chart. The number of hours worked in America versus the number of hours worked among Europeans is crazy. Like, I just want to move to Europe as soon as I see that. I'll even deal with the social democracy and the NATO and the EU and all the nonsense. Like, to live in a place where you get that much time off. I mean, like, it's people in Germany and France, they take off on average 6 weeks a year. They get at least 6 weeks of vacation time. And their standard of living is pretty close to ours. It's not much different, you know? So that, to me, I can only explain that as Puritanism, because we still have in this goddamn culture this idea, and you've probably seen this, right? The idea that people who work hard, no matter what they get for it, are virtuous. Those are the best Americans. Just no matter what you do, even if it's volunteering, if you just work hard, that is the source of virtue in American culture. I think you've seen this, right? Restraint, asceticism is seen as virtuous in American culture. And again, let me say this also, right? Restraint and repression is absolutely necessary, okay? If you want to get certain things. I'm not saying, just sleep all day because you'll be poor, but it should only be strategic and practical, shouldn't it? Work, self-sacrifice, all that stuff. It should be in the service of gaining something else. That makes perfect sense to me. There's nothing puritanical about working 12 hours a day to build a business, to make money, to enjoy life with. There's nothing puritanical about that, about repressing yourself for that strategic, practical reason. That's not what Puritanism is. Puritanism is if you're a billionaire, and look at the billionaires. Look at Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, what's his name, Bill Gates. What do? They have more money than God. They work all the time. Have you noticed? Isn't that amazing? If you were a billionaire, would you be working as much as Bill Gates and Elon Musk are? I'd be on a beach for the rest of my life, laughing at those fools. This is a very strange mindset. It's a very unusual. Very few people have that, but Americans own it. We kind of invented it. Anna Ruth.
Yeah, I think I have to say, by the way, I was very glad to hear that you generally approve of Tamils, but you might be a bit disappointed to find that
Not the Tamil Tigers, though. They're scary.
yeah, no, not them. Fuck them. But
They were
like
nasty,
generally
nasty, very nasty civil war down there. Yeah,
crazy people. Actually, they invented suicide bombing.
yeah, I know.
Yeah,
I know. Yeah.
it's fucked up. But yeah, like there's a lot of Tamil Brahmins, my people, have a very similar conception to the Puritans who came to the United States. I think primarily because of a verse in the Bhagavad Gita, which says it was the avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu, Krishna, saying to the Pandava warrior Arjuna, what was it? Your duty is to do your duty without attachment to the results.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so you might well find that there's going to be a cultural shift if we do import more Indian immigrants towards the puritanical side. But that aside, my question for you was,
Hmm.
Deshay, I thought very brilliantly responded an idea to your question of what is the origin of a new product coming to the market.
Mhm.
And I was curious to understand why you thought that was an incorrect response.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
not. Well, it's not because it's not the original origin. As I said, like I think it's desire is ineffable. It's a feeling or an impulse. It's not. So an idea, as we agreed, right? I thought we agreed is a set is a language is language. That's an idea. There's no,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? You can like have a desire with no language. The idea is language. I
Okay.
really want to have sex with that woman. I really want to have a drink of beer. I want, I think beer is good. I think sex is good. I think leisure is good. I don't want to work anymore. Those are ideas,
The
right?
desire has to precede the idea then.
Yeah.
Got it.
Well, I mean, yeah, otherwise there's no relationship between the idea and the desire. I mean, like, so, it's a civil war inside of all of us every single day, all day long, basically, right? And Freud talks about this a lot. He calls it the tension or the conflict between civilization and its discontents.
Hmm.
What he means by that, he doesn't mean like there are people who are discontented with civilization. He means like inside of all of us, there's these impulses to have fun, party, do things like especially sex and drinking and leisure and being, and then civilization doesn't like any of that. Civilization hates that shit. Civilization wants roads and bridges and astronauts and rocket ships and and algebra. I mean, right? So, and militaries and corporate office buildings and cubicles. That's what civilization wants badly. And cops and rules and streetlights. And that's what they don't want people drinking. They don't want people for obvious reasons, but the sex too. People underestimate this. Why is sex bad for civilization? This is Freud's one of his theses. It's like, well, when you're having sex or even just thinking about sex, what are you thinking about? You thinking about civilization? You thinking about your society? You thinking about God? You thinking about your community? You thinking about serving the people? Hell no. You're thinking about your genitals. Like honestly, you're thinking about yourself. It's totally which again, thank God for it. This is why I love it so much. So but it's all sex is always a problem. And this is, by the way, this is in capitalist societies. It's okay for the consumers to want sex because that's a market to sell to. That's a consumer market, right? Obviously, a very famous one. But you don't want it in the production side of capitalism. And oh, I want to recommend another. It's a really hard essay. The writing is so annoying, but the argument in it is like, I think, really illuminating. It's in oh God, I'm blanking. Oh shit, what's his name? The Daniel Bell. Daniel Bell was a sociologist. I think he died not long ago at Columbia, where I used to be. He wrote an article which became a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. This is a key arrow to put in your all's quiver. So the argument is really similar to mine. I was kind of riffing on it, which is this. Capitalism is made up of two contradictory, even antagonistic cultural impulses, right? So think about the cultures of capitalism. So there's a couple different ones, right? There's the production side and there's the consumption side. And this is why capitalism is so crazy and fascinating and kind of wonderful because it's so contradictory in itself. It's self-contradictory, but somehow it's never self-destructive. It manages to keep going with this contradiction, just going and going and going. On the production side, if you've ever been a business owner, right, you know what I'm talking about. On the production side, how important is discipline and self-discipline and order and repression and like sitting in the goddamn cubicle chair all day long doing the shit you would not do otherwise? Come on. It's just repression. It's just fucking repression. I met a guy who worked, do you guys know what Girls Gone Wild was? It was like an OG internet, like an early internet kind of soft porn thing where they would like go to Mardi Gras parties and with a camera and get the girls to show their tits. And they made a whole like business out of it. It was a big deal. It was a big thing in like the 2000s. Anyway, so like totally hedonistic. It was like girls in hot tubs drinking and showing their bodies and like, like the ultimate hedonistic. So I met a guy who worked there. And he was over at my house. I was having a party and I was like, oh my God, so tell me, what's it like in the Girls Gone Wild headquarters? And he's like, it's a fucking office building where people sit in cubicles staring at computer screens all day. I was like, oh, you mean you don't have hot tubs and doing cocaine off of hookers' asses? No, of course not. It's completely regimented, disciplined, boring, anti-human. I mean, and you're just repressing all your interests, all your desires all day long to do this shit work. Same with Pornhub. Do you know what the Pornhub headquarters is? I think it's a skyscraper or something like maybe it's 20 stories tall in Montreal, I think it is. And it's like floor after floor after hundreds and hundreds of workers on each floor. And most of them don't even ever see the porn part of the business. They're doing the accounting and the SEOs and the analytics and da, right? And it's just cubicle after cubicle after cubicle after cubicle after cubicle of people like repressing what they really want to do to sit there and work. Okay. So the production side of capitalism, as puritanical as you can possibly be, and Daniel Bell says this, but then the craziest, most wonderful, just wildest thing about capitalism is that who are they selling to and what are they selling? They're selling sex and drugs and drinking and not doing any work ever. Like it's the most hedonistic shit you can imagine, right? So it's like Puritans make all this stuff or Puritanism makes all this stuff, but then Satan's hedonism consumes all of it or much of it, not all of it, but especially now there's much more of capitalist production now, as I think I told you, right, is geared toward consumers, right? In the 1830s, they were just making the infrastructure then. 1830s, 40s, right? They were just making the big shit. They were making the railroads and the buildings and the early skyscrapers, and But no, but then it gradually every year there was more and more industries, businesses geared toward giving people what they want. Period. So it's this crazy contradiction, right? The productive side of capitalism, which is deeply, profoundly puritanical because it has to be, is aligned, listen to this, is aligned with American historical formal culture, which is puritanical. So the early capitalists in the 19th century were all puritanical to begin with because they came out of American culture. So they loved that part. They loved the productive side. They loved that people were working 12 hours a day in factories, which was the norm in the 19th century, right? 12-hour days in the factories. Imagine that. 6 days a week. Imagine that. Tending a machine, doing the same thing over and over again. Yikes, right? But the stuff they were producing is always subverting Puritanism and asceticism and all of it. It subverts Christianity. It subverts a lot of Judaism. It subverts it subverts Islam. And that's my new book. The current book is how popular culture has subverted political Islam in countries all across the Middle East and Malaysia and Indonesia for the very exact same reasons that you were talking about the Tamil ideology about work, similar among the Islamist regimes, right? And of course, famously about sex, right? So when they found out about Beyonce in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jakarta, freak out. Beyonce is currently banned from all those countries because she gave a concert in all those countries. And then the next day, half the women in the country were dressing like Beyonce. And so the mullahs, the clergy, issued fatwas against Beyonce, against Madonna, against Britney Spears, against Kim Kardashian, against jeans, against tattoos. The Iranian mullahs have hundreds of fatwas against American popular culture, the hedonism that I've been talking about. So check out Daniel Bell, the cultural contradictions of capitalism, how hedonism and Puritanism are always fighting each other, but it somehow just keeps going. Somehow it hasn't collapsed. It just keeps fighting each other. And out of that tension, somehow we've produced this, global, human, historic, transformational, revolutionary system called capitalism. Wild, I think. So there you go. Great question.
Thanks. Well, what's the name of your newest book?
Then it's not out yet. I just submitted the first draft to the publisher, but it's going to be, it's a history of, Matthew said it was a history of World War II. It's not. That's a portion of it. It's a history of America in the world. It's a history of American foreign relations, but it's in the two parts. The one that everybody knows about, which is, American foreign policy, like what the government has done in the world. So I do that. I tell that from the blowback perspective. And then the other half of the book, which is the really original stuff, is this. I tell the history of the dissemination, the diffusion globally of American pop culture, and what it's done to communism, fascism, and Islamism, which is to subvert all three, while the U.S. government's sending in the military and starting wars and bombing people and assassinating people. All that time in Iran, there's satellite dishes on every roof and every house and every apartment building in Tehran. Everybody in Tehran has a satellite dish, and what do you think they're beaming down from that? Speeches by the Ayatollah? No, they're having Kim Kardashian and Pornhub directly, they're mainlining the most hedonistic stuff from America and the West right into their living rooms. It's a huge, huge story. It's an amazing story of, again, human liberation, the consumer culture liberation revolution I've been describing in America going global. It's happening all across the world. It's been happening every day for 200 years, 150 years. And it continues and it continues and it continues. Meanwhile, the governments are fighting each other and bombing each other, and America's intervening, militarily and heavy-handed ways and sanctioning, right? Oh, we're not going to send you our stuff anymore. The worst possible thing we can do, right? The best thing we can do is just open up the economy, have as much trade as possible. You think communism and fascism and Islamism are going to survive the onset of hedonistic American pop culture? Go to Tehran. I mean, if you guys know anything, anybody here from Iran, like the culture in Tehran, by every account, is like it's nothing but like heavy metal clubs and hip hop bands and women with tattoos and piercings and tight jeans and of course. So, apart from the formal politics and all that stuff, it's a revolution across the country. In Saudi Arabia, which happened in Saudi Arabia just in the last 5 years, women got the right to drive because all these nice cars were coming in from the West, Mercedes and BMWs, and you're like, damn, that's a nice thing to do. And they're demanding to be able to drive because it became fun to drive because of consumer culture, capitalism. Yeah, so that's the book.
Appreciate it.
We'll see. Grove, it's coming out.
Well, let us know when it comes out.
Yeah, the publisher's Grove Atlantic. I don't know. We'll see. I'm hoping by the end of this year, but I haven't heard back from my editor yet. So yeah, thank you, man.
Yeah, anything else?
Okay. Sideways maybe, horizontal. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jack. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very
so
much. Thank you.
My pleasure, everyone. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
What's your dad?